to a Hope 1032 podcast.
Hello, this is Collett Smart. I'm a psychologist and a teacher, and I'm your host on Raising Teens. As a parent, I know that raising a teenager can be an incredible, exhilarating, and joyous journey. It can also be confusing and really lonely at times. On this podcast, we are going to be joined by well-known experts where we chat about some of the most common questions that I get asked about raising teenagers in my own work. Our episodes are jam-packed with support so that you can get on with the job that you do best. That is, connecting with, supporting, and loving your teen. Dr. Michael Nagel is an associate professor at the University of the Sunshine Coast, where he teaches and researches in the area of child and adolescent development, behavior, and learning. He's the author of 20 books on child development and learning used by teachers and parents in over 40 countries. He's delivered over 300 workshops and seminars nationally and internationally. He's been nominated as Australian Lecturer of the Year each year from 2010 to 2017. Dr. Nagel has been an invited guest on TV New Zealand Breakfast, Canada AM, and The Project. He is also a member of the prestigious International Neuropsychological Society. Hello, Mike. Welcome to Raising Teens.
Oh, it's fantastic to be here. Thank you for having me.
I'm so thrilled to have you speaking on the teen brain today. I've actually heard you speak a number of times, and you have this incredible knack of bringing us the science, but also somehow entertaining us at the same time. I know you've won a whole bunch of awards as a lecturer, and I can see why. Let's start a little bit, just really right at the beginning. I want to ask simply for parents who may never have heard or haven't heard much on the teenage brain, what is happening inside the head of our teenagers?
Well, that's a great question. And I think probably for viewers and listeners, the one thing that people often don't realize is that it takes almost 3 decades for the human brain to fully mature. So it's really confounding for parents and teachers alike when they see these young teens who present themselves physically as adults to realize that what's going on between their ears is very different. There's a complete restructuring of many aspects of the human brain and a refinement of some of the processes and things that occur that we take for granted. So we see a 15 or 16-year-old with the physique of an adult without really understanding that while they might present physically as adults, what's going inside their minds is very different.
Yeah. I mean, my 14-year-old, who's my youngest child, is taller than me, and which he absolutely loves. But you can look at your teenage child's body, as you said, and you think sometimes they're able to think through things more than they really are. We all love our teens so much, but I want you to just explain a little bit about what might lead these young people who look more like adults now, but what makes them do something that makes us as adults, or as you say, make their 8-year-old sibling cringe in disbelief?
Well, I think there are 2 overlapping processes that are occurring. One is a complete sort of refinement of the frontal lobes, which are the brain's chief executive officer. So if you think of the human brain as having this hub of intelligence and cognitive ability in the front of it, that doesn't really fully mature till the mid-20s or so. We do know it's roughly about 24 years of age for females, a little bit longer for males. I've heard some scientists say 26, 27, and some people might think, well, no, it's probably longer than that. It might be in the 40s or 50s. Where, the jury's still out. But at the end of the day, the CEO of the brain, the frontal lobes, particularly the right prefrontal cortex, which kind of sits behind your right eye, is the part of the brain that allows you to make responsible decisions. It's the part of the brain that's responsible for analytical thinking. It's also the part of the brain that helps regulate emotions and put the brakes on our urges and allows us to sort of self-regulate our behavior. Now that is changing and restructuring at the same time that the reward systems of the brain for teenagers are becoming engorged with a real powerful neurotransmitter called dopamine, which means teenagers are more inclined to look for sensation-seeking activities, novelty-seeking activities, engage in risky behavior. So it's almost, I say to people, try to think of the brain as an automobile where the frontal lobes are the braking mechanism. But for teenagers, that braking mechanism is not going to slow down that emotional part of the brain, rewards part of the brain that will drive some of the behaviors that we might see.
In my first book, I also wrote about another area of the brain which changes during puberty, and that is the amygdala. The amygdala is the emotional part of the brain that's responsible for assessing threats, impulse, and the fight or flight response. So when our teens are processing social contexts, feelings, or facial expressions, it often goes through the amygdala rather than that logical prefrontal cortex like in adults. Because this part is super sensitive to threats, a teen's brain can interpret normal, everyday facial expressions as anger or aggression. That's why your teen might seem defensive with you, which can just seem to come out of the blue. We need to guide them through these big emotions and model calm, because it won't always be like this. Their brains are still developing. Dr. Nagel will talk with us about neurotransmitters. These are the body's chemical messengers. So coming back to, you mentioned some of the neurotransmitters. Can you just talk us through a little bit how they have an impact on teens' behavior?
Sure. Probably the two most pervasive are dopamine and melatonin. So dopamine is an excitatory chemical. If you're driving in your car and you turn on some music and it's a song that brings a positive emotional response, we know it can elevate dopamine about 9% and you feel good. In fact, you can see this when you're driving your car. If you look, a person sitting next to you and they're quite happy, their dopamine is elevated and they're feeling good. What we do know with teens is that very important neurotransmitter seems to be elevated a great deal in teens throughout the teenage years. It's almost like there's this need to look for things to excite them, which again has an impact on the reward system. The other one is melatonin, and this is one that has melatonin. Most people are probably aware. It's the neurotransmitter chemical that helps induce sleep. And we know that when puberty kicks in, and I think this is really important, I should have mentioned this earlier, is we tend to talk about teens, and we think of them 13 and beyond, but a lot of these changes are actually occurring prior to 13 years of age. And I often link adolescence, when I'm talking about adolescence, to pubescence, because pubescence is a medical term denoting a change in the reproductive system. And we know when that starts to happen, there's actually a sort of an overlap between starting to see changes in the brain. So, and that's happening with kids when they're 9 or 10 or 11 years of age. So for a lot of parents, they start to see changes in children's sleep patterns. So for a more mature adult like me, and I mean mature chronologically, and I don't want to go into age because I'm hitting a significant marker in my life, but I tend to get sleepy, and the release of melatonin, I'm sleepy roughly around 8:30, 9 o'clock at night. And that has some impact by the sunlight, because sunlight has an impact on melatonin. But for most adults, that seems to happen. And my wakefulness will start happening around 6. Now, that's me personally. That's a general sort of parameter because everyone's lifestyle is a little different, people are different. But that whole cycle seems to shift a couple of hours in kids, particularly when they're hit 12, 13 and beyond, where when they used to go to bed at 9, if you tell them to go to bed at 9 and they're 14, they'll lie in bed awake because they're not ready to sleep. So the whole cycle shifts a couple of hours. The problem, however, is that kids still have to get up at the same time to go to school. So we know that teens are chronically sleep deprived, and that has a huge impact on learning and behavior. We know that teenagers need roughly a minimum of 9 hours of sleep a night, and most are getting anywhere near that. And that can have a huge impact on everything from capacity to engage in higher cognitive functioning, such as learning and memory work, to mood and behavior. Because if you're not getting enough sleep, we know the following day, the body and brain can release cortisol, which is a stress hormone, which is something that helps you engage in fight or flight responses. And if your cortisol shoots through the roof and you've got nothing to fight or run away from, you get a little bit moody, get a bit cranky. So sleep deprivation is a huge problem for teenagers. And you can, Go to any high school and watch kids arriving at school. It's like watching an audition for The Walking Dead. As they saunter into the class, looking at their phones and must go to English. And they're just chronically sleep deprived, really problematic.
And it affects their relationships. It affects their schooling. I've often said to parents, you can be paying all the money in the world for all the tutors or schools you send your children to, but if they're not getting good enough sleep, you really flushing your money down the toilet.
You are. And most people don't realize that most of the memory work in terms of shifting sort of short-term memory to long-term memory happens when we're asleep, not when we're awake.
Yeah. And so what do we do with that then, Mike? If, our teens are struggling to fall asleep, but we're still wanting them to have a decent amount of 9 hours sleep a night, what do you recommend for parents?
Well, I say to parents a couple of things to ensure is first thing, in the evening, make sure kids are off their devices probably around 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock at night, because regardless of all the, I won't mention any companies' names, but the gimmicks are set up that say, it limits the blue light. Blue light from screen devices is very powerful at delaying the release of melatonin. So in spite of the filters that are now marketed as it releases blue light, it probably does about 5%. It really doesn't do anything with any great efficacy. And I also say to parents, but if you're going to tell your kids to be off the screen, then you better be prepared to switch off your screen as well.
Yeah, true. One of the most common questions I get from parents is, how do I set these healthy habits for my children when they're different ages? And how do I get my own work done if my technology is supposed to go off at the same time as theirs? We're not implying a blanket approach for every family, and I know this isn't easy. Of course, different ages may have different bedtimes or other limits, and this might be the time where we need to sit with our teens and model to them how we are going to put healthy habits and time management strategies in place for ourselves. The important thing is that our teens know and see us follow these rules too.
So the first thing is to try and find a time in the household when everyone's going to get off their phones, get off their computers and their devices. Second thing is to ensure that young people have a great deal of physical activity, because one of the great precursors to good sleep is ensuring there's exercise. And you don't have to be running a marathon. It just could mean 30 minutes of a walk a day. It doesn't have to be anything too strenuous. And the other thing that's really connected to that is actually proper and nutritious diet. So all of these things fit well together. But I think the screens at night is probably one of the most important things, not least of which is I'm fully aware that there are many schools that will say to their students, you can submit your assignment at midnight tonight online. And I've got two beautiful adult children now. My daughter's 24, my son's 22. But I got to tell you, when they came home from school, the first thing on their mind wasn't doing their homework. So if something was due at midnight, it's like, well, let's get to it at 11:30 and see how we go. So schools can be very complicit, and not that they're trying to do anything pernicious, but I say to parents, maybe talk to schools so that they avoid those sorts of things. Why does it have to be midnight? Why can't it be 8 p.m. or 7? So the greatest thing, I suppose, three things is good exercise, good diet, and making sure that we're off our devices at a healthy time in the evening, which probably is about 8 or 9 o'clock, because we know there seems to be about a 2-hour time lapse between being off the device and regular circadian rhythms taking place and melatonin being released.
Yeah, and I've even heard some schools do some great stuff where they've written to parents saying, if your child is, still busy working on their homework or an assignment at 9 p.m., cut it off and just send us an email to say they couldn't get it done today. And then obviously, some children, they will need some help planning because they may still leave it even though they've had a week. That's a different form of planning. But yeah, it's asking the schools to get on board, and schools are becoming more and more aware of that.
I think they are too. Yeah.
So Mike, then in terms of male and female brains, is there a difference in terms of brain maturation and development?
There is. By most accounts, all measures of maturation for females occurs 18 months to 2 years sooner than it does in boys. And that kind of links even with pubescence. I have this beautiful photo of my daughter when she was in year 7, and she was school captain at her primary school. And then she was standing there with the male school captain, and he's about, probably full foot, 12 inches, or what is it metrically? Sorry, my Canadianism is slipping in, but quite smaller than my daughter. So yeah, it's probably about 18 to 2 years difference for girls sooner. And again, this is why full neural maturation for females seems to occur somewhere between 23 and 25 years of age, and for males a little bit later. Most of the hard work for both males and females is done around 19 or 20, and then it's just a measure of fine tuning over the years. But this also means too that girls' emotional systems are well and truly firing in ways that boys are nowhere near at the same stage in life. So, and so we see, particularly with adolescent girls, a great deal of negative emotion, a lot of negative affect during the teenage years, which is problematic. And I suppose one of those areas when it comes to working with teens that needs a great deal of attention. Boys are really inclined to take a lot of risks in ways that females wouldn't, but teens are more inclined to co-ruminate and feel bad, and we see this through the teenage years in particular.
You just heard the term co-rumination. What that looks like is teens rehashing and going over and over any issues or problems that occurred during the day. Because of technology, this now follows them home, on the bus and into their lounge rooms all afternoon. For our teens, when things go wrong, it can be like a sad song stuck on repeat that can become emotionally exhausting. Co-rumination in girls and risky behavior in boys is something we need to be aware of. If you want to go back and have a listen, we talk about how risky behaviors can become a form of self-harm in Season 4, Episode 3 on boys' mental health. What do we do with that then as parents if we know our daughters are really potentially more emotional? Obviously, there are some boys that are emotional, so it's not that boys aren't, but if our daughters tend to be at a more emotional phase or our boys are taking more risks, what do we do with that as parents? How do we help our teens?
I think there's a couple of things. First of all, it's the first point is recognizing that this is a perfectly natural sort of stage that young people are going to go through. And so you want to find that balance between supporting them, but not curtailing or trying to protect them, all the time, because they do need to take risks. They do need to learn from their mistakes. And there's nothing wrong with negative emotion unless it becomes all encompassing and just takes over your world. So when I'm talking to parents of boys, one of the things that's really interesting too is that boys' risk taking is directly linked to being with their friends or not. In other words, a 14-year-old boy is less inclined to take risks than his father unless that 14-year-old is with his friends, right? So a 14-year-old boy on their own, fine. Which is really interesting when it comes to P players. You put an 18-year-old in a car on their own, they're more risk averse than their parents. Throw a couple of mates in the back seat, all bets are off. So it's about trying to find that balance and create boundaries and structure to be supportive. And for girls, I would say to parents, look, negative emotion does not have to be viewed as something as a deficit, as long as that doesn't overtake their whole world. And you can see that very quickly. If all you're getting from your daughter is negative emotion all the time, then that's a sign that there might be other problems going on and things need a little bit more intervention.
And I've heard an American researcher talk recently about this whole reward system and how for our young people, that's not always a bad thing. It's not that, they're always sensation seeking in the sense that they're kind of swinging from chandeliers. It's also, their reward system is also a good thing. It gets them to do things that feel risky for them, like go out and apply for a job, even though it feels overwhelming, or talk to somebody for the first time. So those things can also be positive parts of the reward system. Have you come across research like that?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I wouldn't want anyone to think that, just because the reward system is sort of in hyperdrive, that's a bad thing, because as you say, it does allow teenagers to take risks and experiment and try things that they might not normally do. It's almost an evolutionary sort of mechanism, because it does sort of promote them to take chances and by virtue of doing that, make mistakes and learn from the mistakes. And that's an adaptive mechanism. So it's not necessarily a bad thing.
As you heard us mention, there are certain risks that are healthy for our teens to be taking. If you want to know more about the research on neurotransmitters and risk-taking, there's a link to Dr. Eva Telzer's research in the show notes.
The problem is, I suppose, when all of that might override any opportunity to really think through the consequences, because one of the difficulties too is that teenagers are more inclined to do something for a reward immediately than think long term about what consequences are, or say, for example, saying to a 15-year-old, if you clean your room today, next week we can take you to the movies. Not going to happen. But if you say, clean your room today and I'll give you $2, you're more likely to get a response. So teenagers are more engaged in that sort of short-term immediate response than long-term content. And this goes through even thinking through their actions about what they're going to do in terms of taking some of the risks they might want to do. So they're impulsive. They can do things. Again, I said, as you mentioned, will make an 8-year-old cringe. But that's actually an important mechanism for learning.
Yes. So given these changes in the brain, do we just say, oh, well, darling, don't worry, it's just your prefrontal cortex to blame? Or do we assume that our teenagers cannot self-regulate their behavior? What do we do with this knowledge?
Well, there is an assumption that teenagers that we might lower our expectations because of that. But in fact, teens are actually quite good at self-regulating their behavior in certain contexts, particularly when they're with their friends. They're very good at ensuring that they say or do the right things, or they use the right emoji, or they make sure that their slang and the colloquialisms they use are, as I've heard one teenager say, on trend. So they can self-regulate. I guess for the adults around them, the opportunity for adults to kind of be that braking mechanism at certain times and help guide them and help create boundaries and borders is really important. So the other thing that's really important too is there's a fairly robust amount of literature that says that while teens are deeply influenced by their peers, we know that probably the most significant person in a teen's life is a significant adult role model. More often than not, it's their parents, but in lieu of parents, at times it could be a teacher, a coach, someone that they look up to and admire. And that's really important.
It's been shown that having a close bond with at least one competent, emotionally stable adult who's sensitive to their needs makes a significant difference to the development of resilience and healthy risk-taking behaviors in our teens. Even though it feels like your teen is trying to push you away, this is the time that we need to lean in, but in supportive ways rather than smothering or controlling them.
We shouldn't just assume that we allow teenagers to get away with murder, per se, but we have to create situations where we can help guide them and help them understand some of the consequences of their actions.
I love that you've highlighted that, because essentially what you're saying is that our young people are in tune with us or tune into our messages so much more than we actually think they do. As adults, we often have this stereotype that they only listen to their friends and their friends' messages are the most important. And actually, we have so much more influence on our teenagers' lives than we really imagine.
We do. And actually, as a little anecdote, I was involved in a research project just prior to the pandemic that was kind of got curtailed long term. But ostensibly, we were surveying, I think we ended up having about 3,000 teens. So these kids were 13 to 16 on smartphone usage. And it was a fairly detailed survey. Now, one of the things that came out of the data, which was really interesting, was that they were able to recognize the challenges and issues, potential issues associated with smartphone use, such as sleep disruption, poor grades. They could very much identify before we even said anything the challenge. So they know there are challenges. What was really interesting is that in follow-on interviews that we were beginning was that a good proportion of these 3,000 kids we talked to, well over 70%, had said something to the effect that, and I'm sort of paraphrasing that, while they were aware of the challenges, they weren't about to do anything of their own volition. However, if their parents had said, okay, time to put your phone away, you can't use your phone, they're okay with that. In other words, a teenager is not going to say to their friends, oh, I'm not using my phone because I think it's not good for me. But they will say, I can't use my phone because my mom and dad said so. So the sphere of influence for parents and coaches and mentors is quite phenomenal and much more pervasive than we actually give it credit for.
I love what you've said there, because it allows our teens to kind of save face with their friends. I've said to my teenagers and my young adults, I've got young adults children now, and when they were teens, I always used to say, blame me. If you feel like you need to get out of a party or do something that you feel uncomfortable around your friends, blame me. I don't mind being the bad cop, and that gives them an out.
It certainly does. And I think for all parents, that peer pressure can be very, very pervasive in the lives of teenagers. But saying to them such that is like, if worse comes to worse, lay it on my shoulders, lay it on mom or dad's shoulders, and they say I can't do this. So you're off, you're off the hook.
In terms of now what we know about the brain then, what do we know and don't we know about technology and its effects on the teenage brain? Because you've spoken already about the effects of blue light, but we've also seen the catastrophizing about what technology does. And what do we really know in terms of the science on the effects on the brain?
I think, well, I'm always cautious when I come into this conversation because I never want anyone to think I'm a Luddite or anti-technology. But my whole view about technology is the fact that anything we do to and with children and young people should be based on the best available evidence. And the current evidence that's been emerging over the last decade or so is suggesting that there are a lot of issues, mental health and otherwise, associated with on-time screens in a vast way, probably more than we can discuss here. So it's about finding a balance. And a colleague and I, we just had a book come out recently where we're looking at the phenomenon of screen time and how it might be impacting on young people and their behavior. And again, what we know is that I don't think we can actually talk about screen time as how much is too much because we can't really test that. But we do know that the most important thing for young people, whether they be 8 or 18, is time with friends and family, in social environments, in real time, not virtual time. That is so important in terms of all measures of development. Cognitive, social, emotional are enhanced by being with other people. So it's about ensuring that whatever balance you see with technology and young people is that you don't want the balance to be shifted so it's mostly on screen and nothing else. You want it the other way around. So young people need to be with young people. They need to be with their family and friends. They need to be engaging in extracurricular activities. They need to be outside. They need to be doing the things that generations of people have done over the years. Because a lot of people tend to forget too, if I were to say to you, or I say to many adults, do you know when the first smartphone was readily available to people? They're often amazed when you say, well, it was roughly about 2007, right? So we've only seen these things in play in our lives for less than 2 decades, really. And now we're beginning to see, look, they're great devices to have, but that thing you hold in your hand is ostensibly a computer with the same sort of power as, in fact, I was reading a really interesting analogy saying that a smartphone has the same computing power as what was used to launch a Saturn V rockets and send Apollo 11 to the moon, right?
Wow.
It has the same power that. So
I didn't know that.
You hold this device in your hand that gives you this, but we are seeing that there are some problems associated with a vast array of things, not just time on screen, but where that time is going and who people are engaging with and what the teens are engaging with. So it's about ensuring that the balance is not more on technology, but more on the positive things we know that have a huge positive impact on young people.
So then, Mike, finally, a question that I ask all my guests. What is your hope for teenagers today?
That's a very interesting question. One of the things, I teach a first-year undergraduate course here at my university. And so they're all bright-eyed, they're 18 roughly. And I'm always enthused by their optimism, even in the, as we move from a pandemic to an endemic situation. And I love teaching the first years because of enthusiasm. But I'm also really, what's the word I'm looking for? Encouraged by the fact that young people are really switched on. They really are, and probably through technology, ironically, they're really well and truly aware of challenges and issues associated with technology and growing up. And I think the future is actually quite bright for them, as long as the parents and adults around them continue to be supportive and remember that they play such an important role in the lives of these young people.
I love how Dr. Nagel explains the science behind some of these behaviors and what the brain changing actually means for our teens. I'm also loving this research on neurotransmitters and healthy risk-taking in teens. If you would like to know more about this, there's a link to Dr. Eva Tels's research in the show notes. And if you'd like to know more about Dr. Nagel's work or buy his books, you can find him at michaelnagel.com.au. You can also find me or leave a question for a future episode at raisingteenagers.com.au or via the Raising Teens page at hopepodcast.com.au. Please subscribe and review wherever you listen to your podcasts. I'd love to see you next episode, and in the meantime, keep parenting with your teen's future adult in mind.
This episode was hosted by Collett Smart, edited and produced by Alec Green, imaging by Lucy Weil, and social media by Beth Rivers.
Hope 1032. Thanks for listening.